The Galactic Council's voice echoed across the cosmos, a transmission of absolute dominance. We are the Council, the rightful rulers of this galaxy. No force can stand against us. Earth will surrender, or Earth will burn. It was not a threat. It was a statement of fact. Above the blue-green planet, their fleets stretched across the sky like a tidal wave of metal and death. Monolithic dreadnoughts, each the size of a city, loomed in low orbit, their sleek, obsidian hulls absorbing sunlight. Swarms of fighter drones flickered around them like hungry insects. Below, cities teemed with panic, governments buckled under the weight of an inevitable war, and humanity prepared for a battle they were never meant to win. In Washington, D.C., deep beneath the White House, General Alexander Graves watched the holographic projection of Earth's final hours. A career soldier, forged in the fires of 100 conflicts, he had always been a man of measured action. But now, as the weight of extinction pressed against his ribs, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Cold, simmering rage. "The Council demands a response," the Secretary of Defense said, voice tight. "What do we tell them?" Graves exhaled a slow, controlled breath. "We tell them nothing." President Monroe, a shrewd woman who had built her legacy on calculated risk, turned her gaze to him. "Explain." "They expect fear. They expect diplomacy." Graves gestured to the display, where alien warships circled the globe like vultures. "But they don't expect silence. Make them uncomfortable. Make them wonder why we haven't begged yet." A tense pause filled the bunker. The president nodded. "Do it." The message was sent. No reply. No surrender. Above the planet, aboard the flagship Inviolate, Commander Zyros of the Council watched the human response, or lack thereof, with detached curiosity. A member of the Zelvarn species, his skeletal frame was clad in ceremonial battle armor, his elongated eyes narrowing as he observed the static on the screen. How peculiar. He turned to his second-in-command, a towering insectoid tactician named Varric. "They defy us through silence." Primitive stubbornness, Varric hissed. "Should we demonstrate our power?" Zyros considered it for a moment, then nodded. "Let us remind them why resistance is meaningless." On Earth, millions of civilians were still evacuating when the sky ignited. From the darkness of space, a single beam of white-hot energy lanced downward, striking New York City's heart. Within seconds, the skyline evaporated, the shockwave shattering buildings for miles. Smoke and fire curled into the heavens. In less than a breath, millions were gone. Graves did not flinch as the reports flooded in. The war had begun. Across the country, military installations braced for impact. Fighter jets screamed into the sky, launching futile missile barges at the Council's atmospheric drones. Lasers cut through the clouds, reducing squadrons to ash before they even reached altitude. The world's greatest armies had become insects against a hurricane. Yet in the ruins of New York, where the air reeked of scorched flesh and molten steel, a single woman rose from the wreckage. Captain Sarah Kane coughed, blood flecking her lips, her body battered but unbroken. The world around her was a graveyard of glass and bone. She had been on leave, visiting her brother when the sky fell. Now, as she staggered upright, eyes burning with fury, she heard the mechanical whir of an alien scout drone hovering nearby. She grabbed a piece of twisted rebar, its inch sharpened by the explosion. The drone's cold, blue sensor pulsed as it detected her movement. It aimed its plasma rifle. Kane lunged. The metal spike drove deep into the drone's core, sending it sputtering to the ground. She yanked its rifle free and turned toward the distant warships. "All right, you sons of bitches," she muttered, wiping blood from her cheek. "Let's see how good you really are." Deep within the war bunker, Graves watched as satellite feeds painted a grim picture. More cities were falling. Washington would be next. But he wasn't thinking about defense. Defense was for people who wanted to survive. He wanted to win. Turning to his staff, he said, "We need to hit back, and we need to do it now." A colonel shook his head. "Sir, our forces can't." Graves cut him off. "I'm not talking about conventional forces. I'm talking about asymmetric warfare." The room fell silent. The implication was clear. Humanity couldn't overpower the Council, but they could bleed them, make them regret setting foot on Earth. President Monroe's voice was steady. "What are you proposing, General?" "A full-scale insurgency," Graves said. "We take the fight underground. We sabotage their supply chains. We make their occupation so costly they can't afford to stay." Monroe studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Make it happen." The plan was set into motion. Across the country, elite strike teams mobilized. Scientists and hackers worked to disable the enemy's technology. And Graves issued one final order to the surviving military leaders worldwide. "No more rules of engagement. No more honor. We fight like devils." Because that's what they fear the most. As night fell over the burning remains of the world, the first shots of a new kind of war were fired. Humanity was wounded, but not broken. The Council had expected submission. What they got was something else entirely. The war had entered a new phase. It was no longer an invasion. It was an occupation. And the Council, for the first time in its history, found itself losing control. They had expected a short campaign, an overwhelming display of force followed by swift surrender. Instead, they had stumbled into something else. Something worse. Earth did not fight like the other civilizations they had crushed. There were no grand battles in open fields, no organized fleets to dismantle. The humans did not march in formation or meet them head-on. They struck from the shadows, attacked without warning, and vanished before retaliation could be delivered. And nowhere was this more evident than in the ruins of Chicago. Commander Zyros stood amidst the crumbling cityscape, his cloak billowing in the ashen wind. The air carried the acrid scent of burning metal and decaying flesh. What should have been a simple pacification had turned into a bloodbath. His forces had moved in to establish a forward command post, expecting minimal resistance. Instead, they had walked into a carefully laid trap. A dozen war machines lay smoldering in the streets, their once impenetrable hulls ripped open by shaped charges and crude but effective explosives. Bodies of his soldiers littered the ground, some missing limbs, others reduced to unrecognizable heaps. It was not the work of a desperate, dying army. It was calculated, tactical. Zyros pressed a clawed hand to his communicator. "Report." A crackling voice responded. "Human insurgents breached the outer defenses. We lost 3 platoons in the first wave. They used electronic interference to disrupt our scanners. We never saw them coming." Zyros clenched his jaw. This was unacceptable. The Council had crushed empires. They had exterminated species. They did not lose. Yet in the last 72 hours, they had suffered more casualties than in a century of conquest. And the worst part? He couldn't even see his enemy. In the wreckage of a collapsed high-rise, Captain Sarah Kane watched through the scope of her stolen alien rifle. She had been awake for nearly 48 hours, her muscles burning with exhaustion, but she couldn't afford to rest. Not now. Not while they were winning. She exhaled slowly, steadying her aim. Below her, Zyros stood in the open, his ornate armor gleaming under the moonlight. One shot, perfectly placed, and she could end this war right here. Her finger hovered over the trigger. Then, instinct screamed at her. Asterisk move? Asterisk. She twisted just as a plasma round tore through the concrete beside her. A second shot followed, slicing through her shoulder. Pain lanced through her body, but she rolled with the impact, tumbling down a pile of rubble as enemy soldiers closed in. They'd been waiting for her. She hit the ground hard, breath knocked from her lungs. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the ruins. Their language was guttural, a series of clicks and hisses, but she understood their intent. They weren't taking prisoners. Blood dripped from her wound as she reached for the knife strapped to her thigh. She could feel the warmth of it spreading down her arm, but adrenaline dulled the worst of the pain. The first alien rounded the corner. Kane surged forward, burying the blade into its throat. It let out a strangled gurgle, collapsing as she ripped the knife free. The second soldier raised his weapon, but she was already moving, snatching up the fallen rifle and firing a single, precise shot. The alien's head snapped back, body crumpling to the ground. Silence followed. Then a voice crackled in her earpiece. "Kane, what's your status?" Grimacing, she pressed a hand to her bleeding shoulder. "Little busy right now, Graves." In the hidden command center beneath the Rockies, General Alexander Graves paced before a war table littered with scattered intelligence reports. Every piece of data told the same story. Earth was still losing, but not as quickly as it should have been. The Council was bleeding, and that meant something. He turned toward the group of strategists surrounding him. "We need to step up our attacks. Hit them harder. Make them regret setting foot on this planet." A young officer shifted nervously. "Sir, our resources are stretched thin. If we keep this up, we'll burn out before they do." Graves' expression was carved from stone. "That's where you're wrong." He tapped the display, bringing up a list of targets. "We're not playing to win conventionally. We're playing to break them. Their commanders aren't built for prolonged warfare. They think in terms of overwhelming force, not endurance. So we don't give them a battle. We give them a quagmire." The room fell silent. They all knew what this meant. Total war. No rules. No restraint. Graves turned to his communications officer. "Broadcast the message." Minutes later, across the ruined cities of Earth, speakers crackled to life. A voice, calm and deliberate, spoke to the occupying forces in their own tongue. "You came to conquer, but you have found only suffering. You have found the depths of human rage, the darkness we keep hidden beneath civilization. You have made a mistake. You have made us desperate." A pause. Then, the final words. "And you should fear desperate men." The message spread like wildfire. Among the Council forces, fear took root. Zyros listened from his command ship, his expression unreadable. His soldiers whispered of the humans who fought without honor, who did not surrender, who mutilated prisoners and rigged bodies with explosives. He knew some of it was exaggeration, but not all of it. His forces had begun to hesitate. That was dangerous. He turned to Varric. "We need to crush this rebellion before it spreads further." Varric's mandibles clicked in irritation. "How? They fight like ghosts. They kill from the shadows and disappear before we can retaliate." Zyro's grip tightened around the hilt of his ceremonial blade. "Then we change the battlefield. We bring them out of hiding." He pressed a control on his wrist, and a new order was transmitted across the invasion forces. If humanity wanted to fight like animals, the Council would treat them like animals. Cities still standing would be leveled. Civilians would be executed en masse. The entire planet would burn if necessary. There would be no more insurgents if there was no one left to resist. In the depths of the underground resistance bunkers, Graves listened to intercepted Council transmissions. He knew what they were planning. He allowed himself a grim smile. "They're panicking." Kane's voice came through the radio, hoarse but determined. "Then we hit them harder." Graves nodded. "Exactly." The war was no longer about survival. It was about making the Council regret ever coming to Earth. The sky above Earth was no longer its own. Blackened husks of Council warships drifted in orbit, silent tombs filled with the corpses of the once invincible conquerors. But for every wreckage that fell to the planet below, another ship emerged from hyperspace to take its place. The Council was not retreating. They were doubling down. Their new strategy was brutality. If they couldn't break the resistance, they would break the planet itself. Entire regions had been wiped from existence. Washington, Moscow, Beijing gone. Millions turned to ash. Cities once filled with life now stood as skeletal ruins, their streets littered with bodies. And yet, humanity refused to die. Deep within the Appalachian Mountains, inside the last functioning military bunker, General Graves traced his fingers over a holographic map, his face illuminated by the red glow of burning cities. His forces were running out of time. The Council was pushing toward their final holdouts, and the insurgency, despite its early victories, was beginning to crack under the relentless assault. A voice cut through the tension. "We need to act now, sir." Captain Kane stood at the entrance, her shoulder hastily bandaged, her face smeared with dirt and blood. The last few weeks had carved sharp lines in her already hardened features. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. Graves didn't look up. "We're already acting." "Not enough," Kane snapped. They've started executing entire populations. They're wiping out anything that moves. We need to stop waiting for the perfect strike and hit them now. He finally met her eyes. You think I don't know that? His voice was even, but the weight behind it was enough to silence the room. You think I don't wake up every day knowing how close we are to losing everything? Kane exhaled sharply. Then let's end this. Graves turned back to the map, fingers hovering over a blinking red icon. The Council's main command station, an orbital fortress position directly above Earth. If they could take it out, the enemy's ability to coordinate would collapse. Their fleet would turn from a weapon into scattered debris. It was a suicide mission. Kane followed his gaze. You're thinking about Ragnarok, aren't you? Graves nodded. Operation Ragnarok. A last-ditch, all-or-nothing assault on the Council's command station. The plan had been drafted in the earliest days of the war, but was deemed impossible. They had neither the resources nor the firepower. But now they had nothing left to lose. Kane's expression hardened. Give me a team. I'll get it done. Graves hesitated for only a moment before nodding. You leave in 6 hours. Across the ruins of Earth, the last remaining special forces were called in. Veterans who had survived the worst the war had to offer. The best remaining pilots, engineers, and hackers, all given a single objective: get Kane's team onto the command station and destroy it. The strike force launched at dawn. A stolen Council transport, its hull coated in enemy signatures, slipped through the defensive perimeter unnoticed. Inside, Kane and her team sat in silence, weapons ready, minds focused. There was no room for fear. The plan was simple: infiltrate, sabotage, escape. If they were lucky, they'd live long enough to see the explosions from the surface. If not, it wouldn't matter. The ship jolted as it docked. No alarms, no resistance. The deception had worked. For now, the air inside the station was cold, sterile, reeking of machine oil and alien sterility. The corridors stretched endlessly, lined with smooth metal and glowing control panels. The team moved in silence, every footstep a potential betrayal. They reached the core without incident. The massive chamber pulsed with energy, a web of conduits feeding power to the entire fleet. One well-placed detonation, and the station would be reduced to a burning husk. Kane turned to her demolitions expert. Set the charges. The soldier nodded, pulling a compact explosive from his pack and affixing it to the main conduit. 10 minutes. That was when the alarms began to scream. Doors slammed shut. Lights flared to life. A voice, cold and venomous, echoed through the station. Impressive, Zyros said. He stood on the elevated platform above them, flanked by a squad of elite enforcers. His gaze locked on Kane. You humans, he continued, his tone filled with something that almost sounded like admiration. You were never supposed to survive this long. Kane raised her rifle. And yet, here we are. Zyros smiled. A slow, deliberate thing. Indeed. But this ends now. The enforcers moved as one, weapons raised. Kane didn't wait. She fired first. The room erupted into chaos. Plasma bolts tore through the air, searing the walls and sending sparks cascading to the floor. Kane dove behind a console, returning fire in precise bursts. Her team scattered, using the station's architecture as cover. The demolitions expert slumped to the ground. A hole burned clean through his chest. The timer on the explosives read 8 minutes. Kane gritted her teeth and fired again, forcing one of the enforcers to drop. But Zyros didn't move. He stood, watching, waiting. Then he leapt. Kane barely had time to react before he was on her. His strength was overwhelming, inhuman. He slammed her against the wall, her ribs cracking under the pressure. She struggled, but his grip was like steel. You fight well, he murmured, almost intrigued. She spat blood into his face. His eyes narrowed. Pointless. He raised his blade for the killing blow. A shot rang out. Zyros staggered back, a smoking wound in his side. Graves' voice crackled through Kane's earpiece. Move! With the last of her strength, she twisted free and slammed her knife into Zyros' abdomen. His expression shifted, more surprise than pain. She yanked the blade free, and he collapsed. The countdown ticked to 1 minute. She turned to her remaining squad members. Evac. Now. They sprinted toward the docking bay. The station trembled beneath them as they boarded the stolen ship. Engines roared to life. The moment they cleared the docking clamps, the explosives detonated. A fireball consumed the station, the shockwave ripping through the fleet above Earth. Warships, once organized in perfect formation, faltered. On the ground, Graves watched as the command station disintegrated. The Council's forces hesitated. Their chain of command was shattered, and humanity was ready to strike. The Council's fleet was broken. Without the command station to coordinate their assault, their once flawless formation had collapsed into chaos. Some ships attempted to flee, blinking into hyperspace in blind desperation. Others, disoriented and leaderless, hovered in orbit like wounded beasts, ripe for slaughter. The sky, once an oppressive blanket of enemy warships, was now a graveyard of burning wreckage. But the war was not over. On the ground, the Council's forces still occupied what was left of Earth cities. The invaders had no intention of surrendering. Their doctrine did not allow for it. They would fight until the last soldier fell, no matter the cost. General Graves watched the enemy's movements from the underground war room. His fingers were steepled, his jaw tight. The hard part was done, but the final push was still ahead. A single mistake could give the Council time to regroup. He wouldn't allow it. A voice crackled over the radio. "We've got them on their heels, sir." "Orders." Graves didn't hesitate. No mercy. Across the planet, human forces emerged from the ruins, striking with ruthless precision. What had once been a scattered insurgency was now a disciplined war machine, hardened by loss, sharpened by fury. Armed with stolen enemy weapons and knowledge of their tactics, they tore through the Council's remaining forces like a blade through flesh. In Chicago, Captain Kane led a strike team through the crumbling remains of what had once been a Council stronghold. The city was unrecognizable. Charred skyscrapers stood like broken teeth, streets cracked and littered with bodies. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid stench of war. She moved with practiced efficiency, her team following in perfect sync. Every enemy patrol they encountered was eliminated before they could raise an alarm. She could feel the shift, the way the enemy hesitated now. The Council soldiers were no longer the ruthless conquerors who had first set foot on Earth. They were afraid, and they should be. A scout signaled from ahead, pointing toward a fortified structure at the city's core. Kane activated her binoculars, scanning the area. The last of the enemy commanders had gathered there, holed up with whatever forces they had left. It would be their final stand. She tapped her communicator. "This is Kane. Target located." Gray's voice came through, firm and resolute. "Then finish it." The assault was swift and merciless. The resistance forces converged on the stronghold from all sides, cutting down the remaining soldiers in a brutal firefight. Plasma bolts lit the darkness, bodies fell, and the air filled with the echoing screams of the dying. Kane moved through the carnage like a phantom, her rifle kicking against her shoulder with each precise shot. She didn't stop, didn't hesitate. Every kill brought them closer to the end. She reached the command center, its massive reinforced doors blown open by explosives. Inside, the last of the Council's officers stood in quiet defiance. Their leader, a high-ranking strategist named Varric, met her gaze with something that might have once been arrogance. Now it was just hollow pride. "This is not victory," he spat. "This is desperation." Kane leveled her weapon at him. "No, this is justice." She pulled the trigger. Varric's body hit the floor, the last of the Council's leadership on Earth reduced to nothing more than a corpse in the dirt. Silence followed. Then the radios came alive. Reports flooded in. Across every remaining battlefield, the enemy was falling. Their formations were crumbling, their soldiers surrendering or dying where they stood. The occupation was over. The war was won. In the days that followed, the skies began to clear. The fires still burned, the scars of battle still fresh, but humanity had survived. In the underground war room, Graves stood before a table covered in battle reports. He listened as messages from scattered resistance cells came in, confirming what he already knew. The last of the enemy ships had abandoned the system. The Council had lost. Kane entered, her uniform torn and stained with soot and blood. She exhaled, running a hand through her matted hair. "It's over," she said. Graves met her gaze. For now, they both knew what came next. Victory did not erase the dead. It did not rebuild the cities, nor bring back what had been lost. The war had changed them all, stripped away illusions of peace and safety. But it had also proven something. Humanity was not weak, not conquered, not broken. They had stood against an empire that spanned galaxies and brought it to its knees. Kane looked toward the horizon, where the sun was rising over the ruins of the world they had fought for. She took a breath. Then, with the weight of history on her shoulders, she walked forward.